Victoria Freeman. She's my friend. Is a Canadian of British settler heritage and is the author of Distant Relations, How My Ancestors Colonized North America. She goes back to Plymouth Rock, people. And she really was part of that, you know, her ancestors were part of that process. So what an amazing and brave engagement of history. Because first of all, you got to deal with all her British relatives still living that don't want her necessarily to tell this story, but in the end, still love Victoria. She currently teaches in the Canadian Studies program at Glendon College in the History Department of York University. Her PhD dissertation, Toronto Has No History, which I just read, is fantastic. My son, it's one of the few things my son read notes from with Victoria many years ago, and he has read Distant Relations too. He doesn't like reading, but he did read Victoria. I think I always wanted Europeans to tell their story, because we need to know, Indigenous people need to know, how did it happen? There must be good people, right? There must be. I keep saying that, and yet an entire continent was destroyed, and most of the people in it killed. So how did it happen? And Victoria has taken that subject on.
So I want to start by acknowledging that we are on Indigenous territory, and that this is land that many Indigenous peoples have lived on for more than 10,000, 11,000 and more years. More recently, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas, a branch of the Anishinaabe. So I want to start with that recognition. And also I want to thank the organizers. And I'll say that I think that an Indigenous people's history of the United States is a very, very important book. And it's very hard to read. I had to stop reading it several times. It just, it's a very painful history. And I think we have to live with the truth of this book. I know for me as a non-Indigenous person, I have to feel every emotion as I read it. Shame, guilt, rage, despair, horror, terror, humiliation, grief, and admiration for resilience and resurgence of the survivors. This is a story of atrocity, actually of atrocity after atrocity after atrocity, and it must have been very hard to write. So I want to salute you and thank you for going through that personal pain of writing this book. This is a story that needs to be told in all its unvarnished ugliness. Non-Indigenous North Americans have to let the truth of this book enter our psyches. So I recognize that, as others have said, Roxanne's book is not really a history of Indigenous peoples. That would be a much longer book. It's really a book that focuses more on the colonization of Indigenous people in what's now the United States. And it's definitely written in very broad strokes, and I understand what an enormous work of synthesis this must have been for you. And obviously, when you synthesize, sometimes it's a black and white. You're writing in broad strokes, and it's like the history of residential schools. There's the big story, and then there are a lot of little stories, and some of them may offer different perspectives. But the broad story, I believe, is true. And I welcome it as exploring this history from Indigenous perspectives. This book explores the centrality of violence and killing to American identity. And Roxanne makes very interesting connections between the extreme and total warfare carried out, the irregular warfare carried out by settlers on the frontier against Indigenous peoples, and how this was later legitimized and backed up by armies and the government, and became a founding ideology of the military, and a core aspect of the U.S. identity. And that's a really important argument, I think, to be made in the book. I'm not a U.S. historian. I don't feel fully competent to judge all the nuance of that article, but I will just notice that over the past week in Canada, the Conservative government has called for the expansion of special forces. Exactly what Roxanne talks about in her book. Tracing the irregular warfare that happens now back to the frontier warfare. Canadians often react to stories of American violence and the treatment of Indigenous peoples in the U.S. with a smug conviction of moral superiority, of cultural superiority. I can't do this personally because a lot of my ancestry, as people have mentioned, is actually took place in the U.S., so I recognize my own personal connection. My ancestors fought in the Pequot War and in King Philip's War, etc. And then came to Canada, and like many loyalists who came to Canada, brought their attitudes with them. And so I want to say that these are not separate histories. Canadian history and American history are not separate histories. We are part of a continental dynamic, shaped by the historic struggles for colonial dominance by French, British, and American colonizers, all of them fighting for the spoils, for control and exploitation of Indigenous land and its resources. We are not more innocent than Americans, though we engage in that race to innocence that Shireen Razak has so well articulated. It's true that, say, Olive Dickinson's book, Canada's First Nations, tells a different story than Roxanne's book. Our history is different, but perhaps an equivalent book for Canada has not yet been written. I would also say that Canadians like to tell ourselves that we treated Indigenous people better, that on some scale of civilization, the same scale used all over the world to rank cultures, we are more civilized than Americans, more noble, more concerned with human rights, more peaceful. We were colonizers, we acknowledge, but better ones. That attitude, I think, goes back. I think that attitude goes back to the American Revolution. The British lost, but we made up for it by being morally superior. So our histories are different, but paradoxically, the end result has been the same. The dispossession of Indigenous peoples and near obliteration of their cultures, because the basic assumptions and patterns of behavior are the same. The doctrine of discovery, the concept of private property. And consider this, the only good Indian is a dead Indian versus the only good Indian is a non-Indian. These are both genocidal belief systems. The belief in white supremacy and the construction of societies that entrenched white privilege and power, the same in both countries. Capitalism. In Canada, our racism is more surreptitious, our land theft cloaked in a spurious legalism. I would say geography has a lot more to do with the differences in the first 200 years of our post-contact history. The North has terrible weather and not nearly as much agricultural land as the continental U.S. We had the fur trade for almost 200 years, and that required Indigenous labor, not Indigenous land. After the American Revolution, however, that kind of cooperation ceased to be so important. Even before that, after the British conquest, when British North America also became much more settler colonial in its focus. Just doing a little cutting here. Whereas in the most powerful area of the United States, New England, it was settler colonial from the beginning. So they had 200 years on us. One more minute? Oh, go on. Okay. So yes, looking at our history, so much more I could say. There was less overt physical violence, though there definitely was physical violence. But in the end, the result was the same. As Patrick White says, colonialism is not some event in the past, but an ongoing structure. And structural violence is every bit as destructive as physical violence. Canadians are masters of structural violence. Canadians institutionalized forms of violence that became invisible to the mainstream dominant culture. Legislative violence, economic violence, psychic violence, sexual violence, and spiritual violence have been equally disastrous for Indigenous peoples. Okay, moving on.
One more sentence.
Okay, so I just want to read, I'm going to conclude with a little quote from a recent opinion piece by Scott Gilmore in Maclean's magazine. Who has been promised what in the current federal election campaign? I can't vouch for the accuracy of the statistics I'm going to read, but I presume Maclean's fact checkers do their homework. So he outlines how the entire campaign has been focused on the middle class and on very special, narrow interest groups. Meanwhile, for other Canadians, the last 60 days have not been quite as fortunate. If it's a typical 8 weeks in Canada, then 1,425 Aboriginal kids dropped out of school, a rate 3 times the national average. Since the campaign began, 45 Aboriginal children died in infancy. They would have lived longer if they'd been born in Sri Lanka. As Canadian politicians bickered on the evening news, 1,074 Aboriginal children and 6,265 Aboriginal women were sexually assaulted. Since the writ dropped, 33,534 Aboriginals were violently victimized. Another 182 committed suicide, roughly 8 times the national rate. And if the last 2 months were anything like the last decade, 11 were murdered, at a rate almost 7 times higher than the national average. This is structural genocide in Canada, and it is still unbelievably violent. Thank you.
Okay.